The mother, who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son, Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
You know the poster. A boy with a swollen, lion-like face, grinning like he owns the world. A leather-clad Cher standing next to him, like a bodyguard, who also happens to be his mother. For 40 years, that image has been shorthand for one thing: an inspirational true story. Tears included, Oscar-worthy makeup, roll credits. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The real woman behind that Cher performance spent years quietly correcting the record, in interviews, in offhand remarks to reporters, in moments that never made it into the trailer. She didn't trash the movie. She didn't cry on cue for the cameras either. What she actually said about her son, her choices, and the life she gave him is stranger, harder, and more human than anything Hollywood was willing to put on a marquee. This is the real story of Roy Lee Rocky Dennis and his mother, Florence Rusty Tullis, and the uncomfortable truths she left behind before she was gone for good. Roy Lee Dennis was born on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California, the son of Florence Rusty Tullis and Roy Dennis. Everyone would come to know him by a different name, Rocky, supposedly because, as an infant, he refused to fall asleep unless he was being rocked. It's a small, almost throwaway detail, but it says something about the kid he'd grow into. Stubborn, particular, impossible to simply put down and forget about. For the first 2 years of his life, there was nothing unusual to report. He was, by every account, a normal baby. Then came the ear infections, the sinus trouble. Nothing that would have alarmed anyone on its own. It was a routine visit connected to a tonsillectomy that changed the family's life forever. An X-ray technician noticed something strange in the shape of the boy's skull. That single observation kicked off nearly a year of appointments at UCLA Medical Center, scan after scan, specialist after specialist, until a name finally arrived for what was happening to Rocky: craniodiphyseal dysplasia. If you've never heard of it, that's because almost nobody has. It's a bone disorder so rare that estimates place it at roughly one case in every 220 million births. When Rusty first sat across from a doctor and heard the diagnosis, she was told her son was one of a small handful of documented cases in the entire history of medicine. The disease causes calcium to build up abnormally in the skull, and over time the bone doesn't just thicken. It grows outward, distorting the face, crowding the brain, and slowly shutting down sight, hearing, and neurological function. The prognosis doctors gave her wasn't soft. They told her flatly that Rocky would likely go blind, that he would probably have intellectual disabilities, and that he would not live past the age of 7. He lived to 16. That gap between what medicine predicted and what actually happened is the entire engine of this story, and at the center of it is a woman who point-blank refused to accept the ending she'd been handed. Craniodiphyseal dysplasia isn't just rare. It's a disease that medical literature barely knows what to do with, because it involves ongoing bone overgrowth, rather than a single fixed deformity. The condition doesn't stop once a child reaches a certain age. It keeps building. The skull thickens year after year. The nerve pathways get squeezed a little more with each passing season, and the sinuses and airways slowly narrow. For most children born with it, the disease wins early, often before school age, because the pressure inside the skull eventually overwhelms the brain and the body's ability to breathe and hear and see. Rocky's case became medically notable precisely because he didn't follow that pattern. Doctors who had expected a funeral by age 7 instead found themselves, years later, examining a teenager who could read, argue, joke, and hold down a part-time job. His body was eventually donated to UCLA for research, in the hope that whatever had let him survive so much longer than expected might help the handful of other children who would eventually be diagnosed with the same disorder. To understand what Rusty Dennis would eventually say about her son, you have to understand who she was before he ever existed, because Rusty was never going to be a conventional mother, disease or no disease. She was born Florence Steinberg on May 29, 1936, in Brooklyn, New York, the daughter of a truck driver. She was Jewish, working class, and by her early teens already colliding head-on with authority. At 13, she was expelled from junior high for skipping school. By 14, she was riding with motorcycle gangs and smoking marijuana. At 15, she dropped out entirely and took a job as a dancer at Coney Island, a job she was, notably, too young to legally hold a driver's license for. At 17, she married a truck driver named Tommy Mason. Their son, Joshua, arrived a couple of years later. That marriage didn't last. Rusty moved back in with her parents, eventually remarried, this time to Roy Dennis, and relocated to California. In 1961, Rocky was born. By the time doctors were explaining craniodiaphyseal dysplasia to her, Rusty had already built her entire worldview around one core belief, that the mind could heal what the body couldn't. She would later describe this philosophy in blunt terms. If a person could talk themselves into being sick, she reasoned, they could just as easily talk themselves into being well. She applied that belief to Rocky relentlessly. Every headache, every flare of pain, her answer was the same. Send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. Whether you find that inspiring or unsettling probably depends on how the story ends, and we'll get to that. It's also worth pointing out how young Rusty actually was by the time she was raising two sons largely on her own. She had her first child, Joshua, as a teenager, barely out of her own childhood herself. By the time Rocky's diagnosis landed, she was still only in her late 20s, not the seasoned, world-weary matriarch the film sometimes implies, but a young woman who had already been kicked out of school, already worked a carnival job most parents would never let a 15-year-old near, and already buried one marriage. She wasn't drawing on decades of hard-won wisdom when she decided to fight the medical establishment's grim prognosis. She was drawing on instinct, stubbornness, and a total unwillingness to be told what her son's life was allowed to look like. What the 1985 film did capture, even if it softened the edges, was Rusty's world, a tight-knit, rough-around-the-collar motorcycle family called the Turks. These weren't extras hired to look tough for the camera. They were Rusty's actual community, and they treated Rocky not as a fragile patient, but as one of their own. The character Gar, played by Sam Elliott, was modeled on a real man, Bernie Tullis, Rusty's real-life partner. That whole rowdy, loyal, leather and motor oil family unit wasn't fiction. It was Rocky's actual childhood, and Rusty's drug use, which the film gently framed as a coping mechanism for an overwhelmed single mother. Rusty herself pushed back on that reading. She was candid, almost defiantly so, that she partied because she liked to party, and that drugs were simply part of that lifestyle, not a symptom of some deeper collapse. It's a small distinction, but it mattered to her. She didn't want to be remembered as a woman drowning. She wanted to be remembered as a woman who lived exactly the way she chose to. There's a temptation, looking back at the story through a modern lens, to sand down Rusty's rougher edges, to turn her into a plucky, misunderstood single mom who just happened to ride a motorcycle. That's not accurate, and it's not what she wanted either. She had genuine run-ins with the law that had nothing to do with sentimental, self-medicating for stress narratives. Years after Rocky's death, she was still cycling through drug-related legal trouble, including a methamphetamine possession charge in the late 1990s and a subsequent probation sentence in the early 2000s. She even served time in prison in the years before her death. None of that erases what she did for Rocky, but it does mean the wild but ultimately reformed arc that biopics love to sell you doesn't quite apply here. Rusty didn't get tamed by tragedy. She stayed exactly who she was until the day she died, restless, unapologetic, and completely uninterested in anyone else's idea of respectability. Here's where Rusty earned whatever admiration history has given her. Long before Hollywood came calling, she was fighting institution after institution that wanted to write her son off. Doctors suggested his eyesight was too compromised for him to read normally. She ignored them. School administrators tried to shuffle him out of mainstream classrooms and into special education, treating his facial condition as a stand-in for cognitive impairment. She fought them, hard and often won. In later interviews, she suggested that the resistance she faced from schools had less to do with any real doubt about Rocky's intelligence, which she insisted was sharp and fully intact, and more to do with how uncomfortable other parents were with his appearance. Rocky's own personality did most of the convincing. Screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan met the family while researching genetic disorders at UCLA and came away struck by the boy's warmth and sense of humor. Years later, reflecting on Rusty, Phelan offered a line that has stuck around because it captures the contradiction at the heart of this whole story better than anything else on record. Rusty, she said, was not the PTA Mother of the Year, but she was exactly the mother Rocky needed. That's the sentence that should sit at the center of everything you think you know about this family. It's also worth noting just how far behind Rocky started academically before Rusty's advocacy turned things around. Between his poor eyesight and the sheer disruption of years of hospital visits, he entered mainstream schooling well behind grade level in reading and basic coursework. Rusty didn't sugarcoat this in later interviews. She readily admitted her son had catching up to do. What she refused to accept was the idea that a learning gap caused by a medical condition should be treated as a permanent ceiling. By the time Rocky reached junior high, he wasn't just keeping pace with his classmates. He was outperforming most of them, eventually graduating as an honor student, tutoring peers in his spare time, and negotiating his own hourly rate for it, like a kid twice his age. By 1985, Mask was playing in theaters across the country. Peter Bogdanovich directed it. Cher played Rusty. Eric Stoltz, under heavy prosthetics, played Rocky. The film went on to gross tens of millions of dollars. Rusty Dennis was paid $15,000 for the rights to her family story. Sit with that gap for a second. A movie that made an enormous profit, built entirely on the life and death of her son, and the woman at the center of it received a fraction of what a single studio executive might make in bonuses that year. What makes it sting even more is where most of that money reportedly went, toward medical bills for her older son, Joshua, who by then was fighting a very different battle of his own. Rusty wasn't cashing in on Rocky's memory for luxury. She was using it to try to keep her other child alive. When reporters came looking for the emotional, grateful mother they expected, what they got instead was something far more layered. Rusty called the film a fairy tale. Not a tribute, not a loving memorial. A fairy tale, her word, and a pointed one. In a 1986 profile with the Chicago Tribune, she explained what she meant, saying she had always hoped that showing Rocky's courage on screen would resonate with disabled kids and their parents, and admitting she hadn't expected the film to end up being just as much about her. Site index equals 9-3. 9- for angry face/site. She credited Cher's performance for making her come across, in her own words, as something close to a heroine. It's a revealing quote because it shows Rusty wasn't bitter about Cher, quite the opposite. What she couldn't quite settle into was the way the film shifted its center of gravity. She'd imagined a movie about her son's resilience. What she got was a movie that turned her into a co-lead, a glamorous, complicated, larger-than-life character, when in her own mind she'd simply been doing what any mother would do. On Cher specifically, Rusty was generous almost to the point of self-deprecation. She reportedly felt Cher had nailed her mannerisms accurately, and joked that she'd always assumed she herself was the normal one, and everyone else was out of step. That single line tells you everything about how Rusty saw the world. She wasn't the outlier. Everyone else just hadn't caught up to her yet. She was also blunt about where the film departed from reality. The most obvious change was time. A story that unfolded over more than a decade got compressed into what looks, on screen, like roughly a single year. The second change was more personal. Her older son Joshua, the boy who existed before Rocky, who lived through all of it alongside them, never appears in the film at all. He was simply cut out of his own family story. Then there was the music. Rocky was a devoted Bruce Springsteen fan, and Bogdanovich built the original soundtrack around Springsteen's catalog to honor that. But Universal Pictures couldn't close a licensing deal with Springsteen's label, and the studio swapped the soundtrack for Bob Seger tracks, reportedly without even telling the director first. Rusty's reaction, delivered on a San Francisco talk show not long after the film's release, was short and cutting. She doubted Rocky had even known who Bob Seger was. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal over the switch, and the original Springsteen soundtrack wasn't restored until a director's cut released nearly 2 decades later. The production itself carried its own strange weight. Peter Bogdanovich was, by the mid-1980s, a director trying to rebuild his career after a string of box office disappointments, and Mask represented something of a comeback bid. Cher, meanwhile, was still transitioning away from her music career into serious dramatic roles, and this performance would end up being one of the ones that proved she could carry a film. She won Best Actress at Cannes for it, a genuinely rare honor for an American studio drama of that era, and the film picked up the Academy Award for Best Makeup for the prosthetic work that transformed Eric Stoltz into Rocky. None of that industry success, though, changed the math of what Rusty herself walked away with. A movie that swept award ceremonies and pulled in tens of millions at the box office left a family whose actual lives it was drawn from with a modest, one-time payment and a permanent, very public version of themselves they didn't get much say in shaping. None of that, the money, the music, the compressed timeline, is the part of the story that actually stings the most. That part comes from the night Rocky died. By September of 1978, Rocky's body was finally losing ground it had defied for a decade. He was 16, in a wheelchair in his final weeks, and the headaches that had shadowed him his entire life had escalated past anything that could be managed. On the night of October 3rd, 1978, the family went out with their extended biker circle, the way they often did. Everyone who saw Rocky that evening could tell how much weaker he'd become. When he got home, a headache set in, nothing unusual on its face, except that nothing about Rocky's condition was ever really usual anymore. Rusty responded the way she always had. She sent him to bed and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky died in his sleep early the next morning, at home, at 16 years old, 9 years past the death sentence doctors had given him in early childhood. The film shows Rusty finding his body herself, a wrenching, cinematic moment. That's not what happened. At the time of Rocky's death, Rusty wasn't home at all. She was at her lawyer's office, dealing with a drug possession charge. It was her partner who found Rocky and called to tell her the news. That gap between the movie's version and the real one isn't a scandal.